I'd like to welcome everyone to the Luncheon Panel. I'm going to say a few words before I introduce the panel. There's some things that have really changed over the time with flight surgeon. UTMB and Cheryl Lowry is the residency coordinator down there now. We've placed about 30 residents at UTMB now. You can be in the military, a flight surgeon, have 1 year internship, be a general medical officer, and do an 8-week, 10-week course and be a flight surgeon. The doctors who come to work at JSC now as flight surgeons all of them do a clinical residency in some area, whether it's emergency medicine or internal medicine or urology or what have you. They also do 2 years at least training at UTMB and become board certified in aerospace medicine. NASA wants people to be board certified, and usually in the area that they're of their clinical expertise. And right now, about half of our flight surgeons that come through our residency are engineers as well. And since NASA and spaceflight really is an engineering activity, it's been extremely helpful for communication and when you start thinking about designing spacecraft and those sort of things. The elephant in the room for flight surgeons always, though, is that what he said earlier in that film is that we do determine whether someone gets the keys to go up and work on the International Space Station. And I always, that's kind of an area you can't get rid of. It's the elephant always in the room. And I always talk to medical students who think you should never discriminate, everything should be great. And I ask them, okay, you're getting ready to fly on United from Houston to London, and the pilot who gets in has a seeing eye dog and a white cane with a red tip, and he's totally blind. He's also deaf. And 5 years ago, he had lung cancer, but now it's metastatic to the brain, and he's having seizures that we can't control medically. Would you fly with this pilot to London? And if they're being honest, the answer is no. And once you've said no, you realize that we discriminate. And everything that we do in aerospace medicine is where do you draw the line? And that line has moved to the right tremendously. It's not just due to flight surgeons and what we do, but there's a $20 million, say, investment to get an F-18 pilot to get ready to go into space. But we have so many things that are from genomics to being able to do cardiac surgery through your veins, the ability to do MRIs and CTs, all the modern medicines we have really allowed us to fly people with significant medical problems. It's rarely talked about, but just to give you some examples, we've flown crew members into space who've had strokes, who've had metastatic cancer to regional lymph nodes, who've had heart surgery, have lens implants. We've had multiple ones with atrial fibrillation, I think one with atrial flutter. We've had retinal detachments and vitreous detachments that were treated and recovered, corneal surgery, and probably the most common thing is an awful lot of major trauma from the basketball courts and bicycles and other vehicles. And the number of people that we've been able to fly is really amazing. But there is that rare time when you aren't going to be able to give someone the keys to the International Space Station or maybe go to Mars. Another thing that I noticed a long time ago is that it would be shocking, actually, to me as a flight surgeon to have an astronaut with a new condition to come into my office who hadn't already seen, back in the old days, Joe Kerwin or Sonny Carter or Ellen Baker or now Serena Auñón. You'd almost think they were retarded if they hadn't actually checked on these things. And it makes the history exam very important, where you say, first thing you say is, well, what do you think it is? Because they will have been to the internet, they'll have talked to people, and that's normal. But I want to read you one book quote. This is, I have about 53 books written by astronauts, and this is almost the same in every one of them, this particular occurrence. And this involves a story 6 days before launch at the Cape. I won't say who wrote this book, Walt, but I will read it anyway. From what I could tell of my symptoms, at 36, I was having a heart attack. Two of our doctors, the NASA doctors, were at the party I was attending, but I gave only fleeting consideration to calling on them for help. Hell, in 2 days, they would be giving me my F-4-day flight physical, and I'll be damned if I'd give them that extra information they could use against me. I called a friend, Al Bishop, and asked him to arrange a discreet visit to a doctor. Al knew his way around the Cape, understood NASA, and didn't need to be told why I was resorting to such private channels. And so this is fairly consistent in the books. Astronauts often will seek out care. It's a touchy area, but I don't think it's particularly unexpected that those things do happen. We have a great panel today. We're hoping to not do all of the traditional flight surgeons things. That's why we had the movie. But to look maybe at the difference now with 6-month flights, working with the flight surgeons, how that might be applied to Mars missions. We also have other aspects that we're going to cover. We're so lucky, and I'm going to do just a very, very brief introduction to the panel. This is a great panel. How many panels have you ever had at ISMS that have 2 major generals on your panel? We do. First to my left, we have 2 people who've actually served as flight surgeons and then as crew members. Serena Auñón, to my left, is now at LSU, and she works at NASA, UTMB, and at LSU. But she was a flight surgeon, internal medicine physician, and then became an astronaut and has recently done an increment on the International Space Station. To her left is Mike Barrett. He's been introduced here many times. I won't mention Manura this time with regard to Mike, but he is an internist. He's a pilot. He served as a flight surgeon at NASA. He flew on shuttle missions. He flew on a long-duration space flight. He spent 2 or 3 years with the Human Research Program at NASA. And to his left sits the flight surgeon who covered his mission. So that's why they're together, so they can kill each other if they need to. But Ed Powers has been at NASA, I think, twice. He's an emergency medicine physician, aerospace medicine trained, as kind of most everybody is now. He's currently at UTMB, and the program that he heads up the aerospace medicine program, where we've worked up 16 of the commercial spaceflight participants, and he is overall the residency program, the clinics, and is head of aerospace medicine at UTMB. The one to the left, is Bill Shepard. He's been introduced. I won't say too much about that, but the first mission I worked as a flight surgeon was his first mission on STS-27, and I enjoyed their crew entertaining me all morning long on the intercom telling jokes. It was great. I do have a question I hope he'll answer, is that Bill was interviewed in 1980, and he was interviewed in 1984, and I'd like to know which of those 2 he used the line about he was the best at killing people.
No one can ever know the true story.
And then Alex Grecian, been a long-term friend. He actually is pretty dumb because he went flying with me one time. But he was a colonel in the military in Russia. He's been doing, through GCTC and through coming over to the United States, he's been supporting human spaceflight in Russia for many, many years. He's a great friend, and I know he'll have some great stories from the Russian side. Brian Pinkston is next. Brian's a little bit different. He's from the military background, and we wanted to cover that. He was an Air Force colonel and is retired. He spent quite a bit of time in Oklahoma City educating the 3,500 or so aviation medical examiners that provide medical support for general aviation and commercial aviation in the United States. And he's also in charge of the Aerospace Medicine Center at UTMB that works up pilots, does a lot of work now with commercial spaceflight. And then Major General Joe Schmidt is a family medicine doctor, spent a lot of time in Japan. I may have to get you to translate for Dr. Mitsumara. But he is family medicine, aerospace medicine, in the Air National Guard as a Major General, worked many long-duration space flights, and has been at NASA for a long time. I forgot how many years, but a long time. And then Hiro Mitsumara is a major general was in the Japanese military and is now lead for JAXA at the Johnson Space Center and in Japan, and has been doing that for about, what, a year now, Hiro?
Yeah. About
1 year. Anyway, that's our panel. There's a great panel. I hope we get time for some tough questions for everybody, but we'll start with Serena.
All right, thank you, Richard. It's definitely an honor to be on this panel with everybody that I've worked with for many years, with most of you. And I'll keep my comments short because I know folks do want the chance to ask questions. And so I'm also going to give you a little bit of my personal experience because I think that's what folks want to hear, is how I felt as a flight surgeon suddenly becoming an astronaut, then launching to the space station. Before I launched, before I went to the astronaut corps, I taught a lot of classes, gave lectures on how physiology changes in spaceflight, how the astronaut first feels when they get up there without having experienced this myself. So when you finally do launch, I think the first thing you do as a physician is sit there and just evaluate how your body is adapting. And it's remarkable. Certainly the first few days, we had a 2-day ride to ISS. You don't feel great. I'll be honest with you. That quickly passes, and certainly over the next 3 to 4 to 5 days to a week, you watch at how tremendous the tremendous job your body does at adapting to a really novel environment. Your brain, I think, is reprogramming everything from body position sense to how you move in a 3D fashion to what is up and what is down. And we shouldn't take that for granted. I think too often we don't give the body enough credit for what it can do. Now, that being said, there are a lot of challenges with the physiology that folks talked about earlier that we don't often feel while we're up there. And so, that leaves a lot of gaps still open. But for me, at least, the first week while I was up there, I really felt all these changes acutely happening. The only thing that felt normal the first couple days was brushing my teeth. That was such a relief to brush my teeth because that was the only thing that felt normal. Certainly going to the bathroom, not normal. It's a terrifying experience the first time you do it because it's you versus the machine, right? And you're just praying nothing goes awry, and then it's a mass apocalypse and trying to clean up everything afterwards. And honestly, every day it's almost a little bit of a battle. You're never quite comfortable with the WHC or our toilet. It's almost like the mafia, right? You never turn your back on it for very long because you're not sure what might happen. You're always paying attention. Things that surprised me, from a body standpoint, I read about the literature about sleep and how sleep was not as great, sleep quality wasn't as good. I slept like a rock up there, and I think I was on the very tail end of whatever curve that exists for sleep quality on station. But on weekends, I'd sleep almost 11, 12 hours each night if you let me. Night before landing, on dock and landing, I slept 14 hours. I never took any sort of medication. So I don't know what that says about me and my physiology or what that says about me phenotypically. I don't know. I think those are some of the things that we're having to investigate. The other thing that I'll touch on just briefly before turning it over to Mike is what I found to be so important up there are the behavioral aspects of a mission. We had a lot of stuff that happened during our mission. We had a hole in our Soyuz, which led to a depress of that kind, first time ever happening on station. We also had a Soyuz abort during October, and so our crew, which was a crew of 3 and supposed to increase to a crew of 5, suddenly found ourselves a very small crew of 3 for about 2.5 months, not knowing also when we'd be able to come home initially, not knowing when we'd be able to resolve what happened with the Soyuz. We were thrilled because our friends were safe on the ground. The launch abort system worked beautifully. But it still left this huge gap, and I think a lot of folks were very concerned about us psychologically. We had been up there for so long at that point that we knew how to live and work as a crew. We knew what was important. We knew about self-care and team care. We knew that our behavior impacted others at all times. We were, culturally very tied in with each other, with each other's families. We would celebrate birthdays for any family member. It could be a distant second cousin, but we would celebrate it as often as we could up on space station. So for us, we never felt the stress of a German, an American, and a Russian living together, representing our countries on board ISS. Folks were concerned about that because we would get several calls from people, but I never felt that stress. But I think what that did drive home was one of the biggest challenges I think we have going forward that I never really grasped the importance of as a flight surgeon, and that was, how do you behaviorally train somebody to go on longer and longer missions? You know, we're very well tied into Earth. We could have direct communication with our families. So even as all these things went wrong during our mission, we were able to adapt and overcome pretty quickly. And part of that says something about the crew, but part of that says something about the support that's available during that time. And that will be more challenging as we go further and further out. And I finally end with, you know, when we were up there as a crew of 3, this was about a few days after the abort occurred, and we realized it was just going to be us 3. And we had actually called Nick Hague on the phone and said, hey, we are so happy you guys are safe. Can we have your food? Because, you know, hey, that's what it's about, but that's all we really cared about up there at that time. We decided to celebrate and have a party, just us 3 on space station, with, you know, as best we could have a party. And we did that because we had recently watched a documentary on Shackleton and some of the techniques he used with his crews way back. So let's not forget our history and how behavior impacts exploration class missions, but how you can overcome some of those greatest threats. Those lessons still hold true to this day. And we found ourselves following those same tenets of Shackleton, and they still work, even on board ISS.
I wouldn't have asked about the food.
He had a lot of candy there.
So I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about flight surgeons. It's kind of weird to be between my mentor when I was a junior flight surgeon. Richard was my first boss, and my classmate, Dr. Powers, who became my flight surgeon for my 2 missions. I'll tell you up front that I loved being a NASA flight surgeon. It was what I found to be the second best job in the agency, but I absolutely loved it. And I would say for the first 5 years I was an astronaut, I missed my old job much more than I liked my new job. It really rocks to be at the cutting edge of that type of medicine and working with the crew in a partnership, which is pretty good. 2 main things I've seen that have really changed in the flight surgeon community in my career. One is the internationalization of things. You know, we started the multilateral MedOps panel largely populated with flight surgeons. And so we have this common operating mindset between our partners, especially in Russia, where the bulk of our international partner flight docs are, but certainly Japan, Europe, Canada. And that has been amazing to watch that evolution happen, the standardization of approach, the freedom of communication. It's easy now to think about picking up the phone and calling our colleagues in Russia and say, what do you think about this? I mean, to me, that's really revolutionary. Another thing is the proliferation of physicians in the astronaut corps. Now, right now, our astronaut corps is 48, 8 of which, and these are active astronauts, 8 of which are physicians. That's 16.7%, in case you're doing the math. That's the highest percentage that we've ever had. And if you do a little bit more math, you think, okay, that's 1 in 6, isn't it? What's the crew size on ISS? Well, 6. Now, the international partners don't have quite that same ratio, but when you really look back, we have a doc on board about half the time, slightly more. Drew Morgan, who's up there now, just finishing up slinging batteries out on the P6 truss, is a physician and a darn good one, a Special Forces surgeon. And a lot of us are aerospace trained, myself, Serena, Kjell Lindgren, Tom Marshburn. And so that has given us a perspective that's really been helpful, I think, to the program and to all of our discipline, to all of our effort. Now, lest you think that flight surgeons are going to go obsolete, remember that we fly not as flight docs, we fly as mission specialists, and that is a tiny part of our training, and our worlds are just that big. So don't worry, you guys are probably safe for a century or so before we have a crew size large enough and we're remote enough to have a really dedicated medical officer. Dr. McCoy is a long way away. You can ask Dr. Powers how busy he was just during the flight handling medical issues, and then of course we dropped the bomb of the visual impairment and cranial pressure syndrome on a mid-mission, which was a huge thing for 2 of us on board the station, both of which happened to be physicians, by the way. But the ground was really busy trying to figure out what to do with this new medical problem. The flight surgeons will be doing that for a long time to come because space medicine is just that big. One other thing I've noticed, and Richard kind of taught me this, after being a practicing flight doc at NASA for about 5 years, I had about 15% of the people on either side of this very uncomfortable fence that we had to straddle really pissed off at me. And when I had that, it was about right. If you didn't have that, you were probably swaying too far one way or the other. But what makes a crew member comfortable in dealing with a discipline, whether it's environmental control, life support, power, crew systems, medicine, is somebody who is 6 layers deep in detail and really, really knows their stuff and can argue and not patronize you, but has a good case to be made. And another quote from Richard is, sometimes you got to go to the door and knock gently, sometimes you got to kick it in. Periodically having to kick it in, you got to go with a warrant, and that warrant is a bag of facts and evidence that you have spent a long time putting together and is as airtight as possible. So that, I think, has served me well. And one final note, and then I'll pass it on, is there's a new generation that Richard alluded to of flight docs, many of which are engineers, but they come already 6 layers deep in detail. God forbid I would ever have to compete with these guys. They're amazing, and they make me sleep really well at night, and they're also international.
Thanks, Mike. Just one word. He forgot the rest of the story about the door, is that my problem's been that I kick in doors that could have just been opened.
Well, I've had the privilege of being at NASA twice. The first time was about mid-shuttle missions in the 40s, I think, is the STS-40s range, and then left for about 10 years and came back towards the end of the shuttle era, which was, I noticed quite a bit of difference between the relationship between the flight surgeons and the astronauts in that time. One of the things we were asked to address is our relationship, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The short duration missions primarily were populated, certainly in the early part of the shuttle program, by military pilots, and Dr. Pinkston will address some of those issues. But at the end of the shuttle program, we were evolving into the more long duration missions, which meant that relationships were far more important. And from that perspective, I can say that as that trust develops, it's a mutual trust between the flight surgeon and the crew member, because developing that trust is so important to not only protect them as an individual, but to protect the team and also ultimately the mission. And so that it takes some time and some development in getting to know each other in order to be comfortable with that sort of a scenario. And in the case of the long duration missions, the pre-flight period is a really good time to get to know the crew members. Usually, if you're lucky, you get about a year ahead of time to work with them in the training program, to get to know them, to understand any medical issues that are going on. And the ultimate goal is to resolve those medical issues early enough that it doesn't impact the mission. And everyone has medical issues. It's not something that's unusual. And Richard has mentioned a fair number of them as well. In the past, it has been difficult to return people to flight with many of these issues because we didn't have the technology to correct them or bring people back to a normal state. And fortunately, we've hit that point in medical technology that we're able to do that quite well, to return people to flight, which also bolsters the confidence in the flight surgeon that if I tell you about something, you can help me get past it before it becomes a big issue. In the mid part of the mission, when they're actually on orbit, that relationship is crucial. We only have the opportunity on the ISS to talk with the crew members once a week, and hopefully, if there are nothing in between happens, you only see them once a week. But there's the opportunity to have that Internet Protocol phone, so that if something comes along that is worrisome, they can let you know about it, and you can sort through whether it's something to be concerned about or not, and that's a very helpful thing. And Mike mentioned that there are medical issues that do come on board, need to be addressed, much behind-the-scenes work determining what the proper way to address whatever the medical issue is, and then hopefully stabilize anything that's there and make everyone safe to come home. The post-flight era that post-flight period is recovering from the adaptation to microgravity, and it takes a while. And in long-duration missions, it takes about 30 days, we have figured, to get everything back to normal, particularly neurovestibular. You don't want to put someone in a car who turns their head and gets a spinning sensation. So 30 days is a pretty good number. So we stay with that crew member all the way through that time period as well. So this relationship actually lasts sometimes 2 years on that one mission. I have had the privilege of working with Mike, both as a friend, a colleague, a classmate, and then his flight surgeon. And it is a tremendous security blanket to have someone who's well trained in medicine in a long duration space environment. I've worked a total of 4 long duration missions and 6 shuttle missions, and I can tell you I've worked both with and without physicians, and I highly recommend that we have someone with medical training, a high level medical training on any long duration missions, particularly when you get to the point where there's communication lags like a Mars situation. So with that, I'll end it, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Ed. And I think I forgot to mention for Bill Shepard that we wanted someone on the panel who wasn't a physician, depended on the flight surgeons, interacted with flight surgeons, and can represent kind of the crew members who are affected by flight surgeons.
Well, kudos to Mike Barrett, who was our flight surgeon on Expedition 1. He did a great job, and I think one of the things Mike helped to wade into, we had a lot of different procedures between what the U.S. side and particularly the Russian side did for medical stuff, and it was kind of a rocky road, but I think we've probably navigated now to a point where we pretty much understand what the other sides do and why, which is good. I came to NASA in 1980, and I had a military background. I was not a pilot, but as a SEAL, you have a lot of exposure to all manner of bodily functions. And so I was in the 10th astronaut group being interviewed, and 16 of my buddies were all in a room, and George was there, and Dr. Carolyn Huntoon. And Dr. Huntoon was explaining to us part of the laboratory procedure, and we each got these athletic bags with about 8 or 10 plastic bottles in them. And she said when we're done with them, we have to be ready to turn them in every morning, and if we need more bottles, we have to go to the clinic and get a reload. And when you void, there's a certain procedure to do this, and you have to void this way and do it in this order. And she asked, anybody have any questions? And I looked at my buddies, and I was totally clueless, and I said, does this mean you want us to piss in the bottles? I did not get selected that year. I think but what I'm saying is, some of the experiences we had as a crew in training, and this is not just ISS shuttle as well, I can remember vividly being in the boilerplate Soyuz capsule going over the side in the Black Sea, and it's very hot. You're climbing all over each other, and you're getting out of your flight suit and into your survival gear, and basically people are throwing up on top of each other in a hot phone booth. And this is one of many environments that astronauts and cosmonauts are getting into to do these spaceflight activities. If there's one thing that I would add about the crew experience going into training is people have to expect this, and they just have to do it. So whatever the role the flight surgeons can play in toughening the crews up, that this is just life. And I'm sure anybody that's done emergency combat casualty care, emergency medicine, knows what I'm talking about. But I think it's a foreign domain to many crew members, and we should probably change that. The other thing I'd like to say about flight surgeons and how they get along with the crews and the missions, I think our expedition had a particular amount of political, diplomatic, programmatic stress that was put on us by any number of people. It was not super appreciated. It was often counterproductive. I'll give you one example. I had asked several years before we flew what the policy was going to be on recreational activities for the crew, including the use of alcohol. And I was assured that because the ISS program had smoothed so many waters, that this was going to be addressed and we'd have a policy. About a week before we launched, I said, okay, where's the reg on how we're going to deal with this, because I want the keys to the wine locker. And I forget who, but somebody in NASA said, oh, no, we're not touching that with a 10-foot pole. I mean, the point being that the crew was just left to work it out on their own, which means that if this ever got to be a flap, who was going to get the blame. And this was one of many episodes like that the crew had to contend with. And not that that's necessarily the flight surgeon role, but flight surgeons should play a big part in how well the crews are getting along, what kind of stress they're under, is it affecting their performance, and I don't think we do enough of that.
Yeah, the same movie that we saw, The Men of the Fighting Lady, that's an integral part of that movie, that the flight surgeon was in charge of all alcohol on board the ship and doled out alcohol when he thought it was needed. Alex.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for the invitation to the summit and for setting up a new flight surgeon panel. I'm going to speak slowly. I'm not a native English speaker, so I would like to apologize for that. First of all, I'd like to discuss or to talk about the way the Russian Space Agency is doing the cosmonaut support with its flight surgeons. Dr. Jennings introduced me a little bit, so I would like to add that I joined GCTC at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in 1997, and in 2003 I became a flight surgeon, so I've been one for 16 years. GCTC, our center, as one of the organizations within Roscosmos, currently has 6 flight surgeons certified by MSMB. It's our International Multilateral Space Medicine Board, certified to work for the ISS program. 5 of them are active and 1 is in reserve. Is it enough? Well, yes. And do we need more? Maybe. But I will cover a bit later about it. So out of 6, 5 female, all are retired military, male, 5 former officers, all are retired military medical officers, and 1 female with civilian background. Just for numbers, the average age is 50 years old for everyone. For instance, I'm 46, so not a young cohort. GCTC medical department has 3 open positions now for flight surgeons, but now it's not very easy to fill them. Unlike those days when GCTC was a military unit and the MOD, Russian Ministry of Defense, provided the center on regular basis with new young medical officers after airspace medicine residency. So in the beginning, GCTC Cosmonaut Corps had 3 permanent medical officers assigned to it. Those medical officers stayed with cosmonauts all the time and had exclusive knowledge of every condition. Flight surgeons would be selected from those medical officers, plus several docs from GCTC medical department who were also certified to support missions, space missions. And today we do not have flight surgeons within the Cosmonaut Corps, and all flight surgeons working the ISS missions belongs to GCTC medical department, in which we all have different positions in various divisions involved in cosmonaut training, medical support, and cosmonaut biomedical and physiological training. So besides the flight surgeon duties, we have other duties at the same time. For example, I'm working in the division responsible for cosmonaut, astronaut, physiological training like centrifuge, altitude, chambers, vestibular training, ambient pressure, hypoxic training. Also, my team is conducting medical support of special hazardous training like survival training, SOCOL and oral spacesuits training and simulations, altitude, chambers, NBL, cosmonaut jet flights, parabolic flights, parachute jumping training, and so on and so forth. And Dr. Richard, I would like to be within the agenda, so if I'm beyond, whether it's time or topic, please stop me. So,
go on for a while, yeah, go on.
Okay. So we Russian flight surgeons are not within the Cosmonaut Corps, but we are very much involved in the cosmonaut, astronaut training and know cosmonauts very well. And though we are very few, there are only 5 of us Russian crew members know us well. We get assigned to them often, and there is a lot of trust between the cosmonauts, their families, and their flight surgeons. That's why, though, we'd like to hire more flight surgeons, but they are not easy to find, and the selection process is rigorous. When a flight surgeon is assigned to a crew member, the crew member has a direct say in what flight surgeon he or she gets. Now, when expeditions overlap, one flight surgeon becomes responsible for several crew members at the same time. It's not a disadvantage, though. The situation creates a very tight-knit community of cosmonauts and flight surgeons. A Russian flight surgeon is much more than a medical professional. Not only Russian flight surgeon, all flight surgeons, I guess, within the ISS program at least. They're more than a medical professional assigned to a crew member. We're their medical, their psychological, family, and sometimes logistical support. It's a challenge, and we become cosmonauts' shadows. We travel with them, we observe their training sessions, we are just as much away from our families as crew members are. However, I don't want you to think that we are the only ones who support the cosmonauts. We have various medical specialists as our support in the background, but not all of those specialists are space medicine trained, but they're highly qualified in their particular fields. One more thing I would like to point out, to echo what Mike said before, is medically trained crew member, or crew members who are medical professionals, former flight surgeons, for example. It's a great plus because it makes such crews better prepared for space exploration and for current mission to the ISS. We don't have so much cosmonauts with medical profession in the background, but that would be very good things to think of. I can't give you exact names and details, but there was a case when a flight surgeon was called in to the mission control in the middle of the night because of a crew member being injured. That was the case. When the flight surgeon got on the loops, it turned out that the issue had already been resolved by a medical professional on board. It's like an example. Am I right, Serena? Yeah. Prior medical training and experience is very useful during medical events and medical research on board. First-hand knowledge of ultrasound machines, OCT, or other medical devices can be very helpful and can reduce the time spent on the activities. No, I'm going to finish soon. So only two differences between the Russian and the US system, that's it. There are two more differences I wanted to point out. All our flight surgeons are trained to extract crew members from the descent modules, or they're within the team of search and rescue for Soyuz landings. And the post-flight rehab period for Russian crew members are longer. The first 3-4 weeks are considered to be an early post-flight adaptation phase and are based in Star City, where the center, Gagarin Cosmonaut Center, is located. Then Russian crew members go into a recovery center, kind of sanatorium, spa resort if you want. It's up to the crew members and their flight surgeons to select what recovery centers they go to. Usually this stage can be 3 weeks long, but it can be extended up to 45 days, depending on the conditions. And finally, as you can see, Russian space medicine support is organized slightly differently. Actually, each country participating in the ISS program has its own space medicine traditions, but we are working together very successfully, and this variety gives us the opportunity to select the best practices possible for future missions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexei. It's important for us to hear. You've only been doing this since '61, so it's nice to hear how you do your medical operations over in Russia. Ryan.
I'd like to thank you, Dr. Jennings, and for the group to have me here. I am different, as he mentioned, and I'll start off saying that I went to medical school and learned after medical school, I went to flight surgeon school and learned to be a veterinarian. Because largely what being a flight surgeon, being the best job ever, is being a veterinarian, at least from the military perspective. And that's what I'll talk a little bit about, and then also talk, he asked me to speak a little bit about more long duration and kind of analogs how military does with long duration missions in different locations. So the first thing is when I first got to a unit, it was an F-16 unit, and it was a guard unit. It was the first time I was actually working with a unit as a flight surgeon. And I learned pretty early on that they don't trust you very well, very quickly. You have to earn that trust. And part of the earning the trust is actually taking the risks that they're taking. So you have to fly along, you have to do, like Dr. Carpentier did. He was one of the guys that went out there and said, okay, I'm just going to do it and see how this works. You have to take those risks before people will trust you. The second thing is they test you to see really, what will you do with, because you are in that situation, the person that can take the one thing that they care about almost more than anything in the world away from them. And so how do you earn that trust? And a lot of times they'll start probing you a little bit and asking you questions. And I finally came to a thought process that I'd talk to any new person that had a question, which is number one, there are rules, just like there are rules flying an aircraft. If an aircraft isn't maintained or has an issue, there are rules that says the aircraft can't fly. Sometimes it can fly. What I became the expert in, though, is all the gray areas of the rules and being able to use every ounce of that gray area of the rule if it was applicable. The other thing was, and the last thing that people seem to understand, especially once you understood the risks that they were involved with, is I won't put myself in a situation where I have to go knock on your family's door to tell them that you're not coming home because of a decision that I made. And they usually kind of go, okay, that makes sense. So fast forwarding a little bit, after that tour, and I did some stupid things like I threw up a couple times, and one day thought I needed to eject just to stop being so sick. I didn't do that, but I thought it really, really hard. I thought, hey, I know everything there is to know. Why would I need to get any more education in aviation and/or aerospace medicine? And I learned actually that, especially to lead a group that's in long duration deployments, you really need to have a little bit more. And if we're talking about the Dr. McCoy aspect, where you're sending someone with that mission, you have to think about all the implications of disease processes as they come. So one of the things that you have to have an understanding about is a matrix of what's the most likely things that will happen and what are the most catastrophic things that will happen. And that's any type of risk analysis that you would do. The second thing is what diseases are common and how do you deal with them. So the liquor cabinet is one of those things that will always be, as long as humans are there, there's going to be a concern about who holds the keys for the liquor cabinet. The other thing is, how do you do an outbreak investigation? Do you have the skills to do an outbreak investigation? Do you have the skills to define what a new thing that no one's seen or you haven't seen before is a syndrome, and then define it as a disease, and then determine, is this a real true outbreak? Is it spreading through the community and that sort of thing? And that's where the aerospace medicine education came from. So realizing that I needed to do that. The other thing is you have to be able to operate in any environment that you might find yourself in. And so, for example, understanding how to take care of people, in my case, in the ocean to space, was really, really important. And there's a lot of folks out there that are doing that now. So one of the things that you also have to do, and I learned kind of the hard way, is you have to understand the mission. Understanding the mission in terms of the operator and being able to speak to operators in their framework, because it really is about the mission. As much as I thought once I graduated medical school it was all about me, it just isn't about me. It's actually about the mission. And once you're able to do that and bring the data to the person who is the decision maker, who's used to taking risks, operators take risks, then that's where the decision comes out, and you can do that. And in fact, that's one of the things Dr. Jennings was talking about, was that in the military, the commander has the final decision of whether someone can fly or not. And so, but our job is to help that commander deal with risks. One final discussion piece about sometimes you have to break the rules and sometimes you have to kick in the door is a case in which we had, in a deployed environment, had an aircraft that had a fire on board on the ground. Started cooking off bombs. It was a fully loaded B-1 bomber. Started cooking off bombs. Now, at that moment, the emergency was over with, but the operations group commander and the wing commander for that location their mission was to open the airfield as soon as possible because they had people downrange that needed aircraft to get downrange. And so when they did that, the medical commander, who was my boss, said, that ops group commander needs his anthrax shot, and I'll be darned, he doesn't come into my group, he doesn't honor me, he doesn't honor my presence, so therefore, you will not go over there and help him out getting his anthrax shot. I command you not to do that, but he's going to ask you to do that. So what I did was I went over and I was responsible for all the flight surgeons. He had an operational group of flight surgeons that was he owned, was responsible for, but I was responsible for making sure the medical care was good. So I grabbed the best flight surgeon, took him directly to his office and said, this is your flight surgeon, they're going to give you the anthrax shot. Don't tell anybody that I was ever here. So sometimes you have to take those risks and do the right thing.
Thanks, Ryan.
Well,
General Joe.
thank you, sir. Thank you to Richard Jennings, Dr. Richard Jennings and Pat McGinnis, because they really set us up to have the best job on the planet as a flight surgeon. We'd all like to get off the planet, of course, but we can do everything short of that. I really have had fun at NASA serving for the last 18 years doing shuttle missions first, then ISS and Soyuz, T-38, and 16 missions on the Vomit Comet undefeated. And I'm currently leading the Orion medical effort to bring us back to the moon. But I'm most proud because I get to take care of Lewis and Clark. We get to take care of the current astronauts, and we also see the retired astronauts, and I've been honored to take care of Gene Cernan, Joe Engle, and Tom Stafford. It really is. We count that heritage. I've had 5 shuttle missions. I'm going to be working my 8th ISS long-duration mission coming up. Lost count on the direct return missions from Kazakhstan, but my friend over here, Alexei Grecian, has beat me with his record number. I know he's gotten me by those. I also believe in serendipity. Dr. Jennings showed a lot of films from the 1940s and 50s, and I was just talking yesterday about with some colleagues about how to support the new Space Force, medically support them, and we shared a Hap Arnold message, actually. He gave a message to all the aviation medical examiners and flight surgeons, and he says this is from the commanding general of the Army Air Force, and I'll just read a couple of lines from that. He said, the first and primary duty of the flight surgeon is in connection with the flying personnel, is the maintenance of the pilot in such a condition that as far as the flight surgeon is concerned, the pilot is always ready for his mission, whatever that may be. And this is accomplished by doing several things: winning their confidence, caring for them when they're ill, participating, as they said, in all their activities, participating when they're flying, supervision of their hours, work, relaxation, and messing, basically they're having fun, and then cautioning them when they have their conditions needed and with advice how to fix that. And finally, he said, I'm really shortening this down, finally the flight surgeon should be a combination of doctor, lawyer, and priest. And so that's a heavy list of things to do, but I can look at some of my fellow flight docs, and they've had to do all those things. Being a flight surgeon is really a heavy, it's basically based on trust. Imagine once a year you're seeing your flight surgeon for whatever your job you're doing, and you've studied for 4 years of college, maybe, and I tell this to my fellow flight docs when they're new, 4 years of college and 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency, then you have several years of experience, and you lose it all one day when you go to see your flight surgeon because they say you can't fly. That's all based on trust that they're going to make the right decision, and we know that. That's what's hanging in the balance. I know that because I have their certification in my hands, but they also have my life in their hands when I'm flying the back seat of a T-38, and I've been taught not to land it, and I bet I could probably get it close, but they have my life in their hands. So my ability to keep them flying and keep them healthy is what I'm really trying to do. I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but we have some NASA data also that shows the more waivers you have at NASA, you actually have a longer career at NASA. Then that makes no sense. You think, well, they've got medical issues, and why would you waive them, and how could that be longer? But there is statistically, there's a Kaplan-Meier survival curve that shows the more waivers you have, the longer you will have a career. And I really think that's because if you diagnose them early, you treat them, you get preventive medicine, you understand the medical issue, and you keep monitoring them very, very closely, you'll be able to keep them flying. It's also based on trust of their family members, and Dr. Jennings did this quite well, and other physicians there, Jeff Davis as well, they cared for the family members in the flight medicine clinic because you know the families, the stressors, you know their situations, but most importantly, you know that the crew members know that you're taking care of them when their family members visit the emergency room. And if you've ever been downrange, if you know your family members are well taken care of, you can put all those things behind you, and you can really do the mission. What is it to take care of a long duration mission? We usually pick them up about 24 months early. We provide all their medical care, certification tests, documentation, mission planning. We get to work with, as Dr. Jennings says, all the engineers on JSC. We look at all the payloads, science reviews, logistics, and we have a ton of deadlines. We really stick with a surgeon checklist, and we remain the point of contact for all the medical science and logistics. The biggest thing we try to do is try to predict what medications we're going to need for a 6-month mission. We have our maintenance medications, we have our just-in-case medications, our sleep adaptation medicine, etc. And trying to design a medical kit to go for 6 months and guess what you're going to see when you're on board is really difficult. But so my personal thing is I go loaded for bear. I take anything that I think I'm going to need because it's very difficult to resupply. We also are working with the standards of astronauts, but after the standards are met, you really have the mission in front of you, and you got to go for the entire whatever you get. As my friend Ed Powers mentioned, we see things, all kinds of things before the mission. We've seen shoulder dislocations, sports industry, chronic problems. In flight, we've seen skin issues, EVA problems, dust. We've had rodents bite some of our astronauts, and just kind of crazy stuff that's happened on board. CO2 levels have been high, and then recovering them afterwards has always been a challenge. I prepare for 5 emergencies: fire, toxicologic, radiation, depress, and medical. And they tell us stack failures don't occur, but one of the most recent missions, we actually had a medical issue and a depress on top of that. And it's a really fun exchange to get a telephone call about 4 o'clock in the morning on a cell phone, thinking, why is the flight director calling me? And it's because we've got a depress going on, and what's our T reserve time, how much time we have before we have to come home. And then we're talking about which crew we need to bring when we bring them home, because based on a medical issue, and trying to explain that to an ISS flight director as well as an ISS program director in the sufficient time to give them whatever they need to make their medical recommendation to make the best possible call is always a challenge. The other things we do, of course, they've mentioned the missions in Russia and Kazakhstan. We also remain the crew members' eyes and ears on the ground. So I get calls from the crew members, hey, how do I look to the flight control team? Am I being too overbearing, or am I being nice to those folks? And we actually can reflect on that. And then, as I mentioned, we're ready for any troubleshooting. Long duration, we go to the moon and Mars, they're going to have issues with delayed communications. We really only get once a week private communications with them for about 15 minutes, and you can imagine trying to sum up a week in 15 minutes is really difficult. We also remain ready 365 on this cell phone over here to be able to take any call from orbit. We also remain the absolute safety officer. I think I've got the catbird seat sitting in the back of mission control because I can look over all of the other consoles and pay attention to what's going on with them to potentially see problems that are coming up and be the astronaut's kind of final call. We also practice absolute empathy. As I mentioned, it started off based on that trust, and so understanding what it is to be a crew member and actually have a couple of millimeters of aluminum between you and the outside environment that could kill you is what we're actually paying attention. And lastly, I'll close with probably the most important thing I think we have working as flight docs is I think we have been integrated earliest by all these groups. I'm looking at Alexei Grishin and our Japanese counterparts and Canadian, and we really do focus on international teamwork because we're really trying to specialize in keeping our crew members healthy and keep them flying. And I can tell you, being downrange with Alexei down in Baikonur, politics never come into the conversation. It's whatever we need to do to take care of the crew members and keep them flying. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Joe did mention one thing, that he's done 16 parabolic flights and never been defeated. And I've done 3, and I just board the airplane in full surrender before I even get on. Well, Major General Hero, if you can talk for 5 minutes, that'll give us 5 minutes for questions.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Jamieson. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Atsuhiro Mitsumaru, and I worked Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force, so-called Japanese Army, for 33 years. And I was a student of Dr. Powers and Dr. Jamieson at UTMB pass short course last year. And now I'm a flight surgeon with JAXA. Today I talk to you about post-flight rehabilitation, especially about our experience of early return program from Johnson Space Center to Tsukuba Space Center on 53 Soyuz landing in 2018. In recent years, we start to early return program from Johnson Space Center to Tsukuba Space Center on 47 Soyuz landing in 2016, step by step to prepare the direct return from Kazakhstan to Japan. In June 2018, 53 Soyuz JAXA astronaut Norisuke Kanai, his nickname was Nemo, returned from the International Space Station. Our early return program was the program that 53 Soyuz astronauts stayed at Tsukuba Space Center for about 3 weeks, from R+9 days to R+30 days. And this was one part of the 45 days post-flight rehabilitation periods. We prepared and managed an exercise environment to carry out reconditioning at Tsukuba Space Center against the high temperature and high humidity condition in summer in Japan. The exercise space was a large space for functional training in a high shaded area in the weightless environment test system buildings. We also use a fitness test room for machine training alternately. We accomplished reconditioning programs for 45 days and the support of NASA's friends. It was our priceless experience to prepare, coordinate, and do how to transport, where to stay, what and when to decide, and so on. Yes, the post-flight rehabilitation program includes a lot of issues to be solved, not only physical issues, but also social issues. For example, when we can stop to protect him side by side, what is useful for him, and when he can start to drive a car in Japan, and so on. Our experience is a big chance to consider them deeply. Lastly, thank you all for your support to our mission, and My big dream is to launch from Japan to space and return directly to Japan in future. Thank you all. This is all I have to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Hiro, very much. We're going to break at 25 after the hour, so you can all go do what Bill Shepard told you to do with those bottles before you go to the next session. But anyway, let's take a couple of questions. Yes, Kaz.
I find this precious, occasion to ask about the feeling toward the water balance in a long duration flight. The Serena and Bill talked about the urination, and Bill should have experience in the dehydrated state. And now engineer, tells us 2 liters per day, and we say 2.5 liters a day. And the natural tendency is that the astronauts becomes dehydrated on board the ISS, but it's in a ground sense. So what's your feeling toward the water balance in a long duration flight to Mars? Any thoughts? Richard?
Is that a flight surgeon question, Kaz?
Yeah, just maybe the crew point of view, or the looking into your body while in flight.
Expedition 1, we did not feel like we were constrained. We ate and drank everything in sight and felt good about it. I think our consumption was within the guidelines, maybe a little bit over, but not much.
Well, he's correct. The data are pretty clear that there's a lot of overhead to drinking water and getting rid of water. And also you can be kind of distant. The space station's fairly big, and people do tend to drink less and urinate less in space than they do on Earth because there's a lot of work involved with it. That does put them at some risk for kidney stones. As you know, you can take someone who's at low risk for kidney stone and take them off water and make them high risk, and vice versa. But it's a kind of a workload issue. I'm not a crew member, but I think that's one of the big reasons you see that.
Yeah, I mean, when we brought the potable water dispenser online during Expedition 2019, and drink consumption went up a lot just because the overhead was down. But people tend to run hyperosmolar in the urine. And like Richard said, that we don't drink enough, really, and we don't pee enough compared to terrestrial norms. And if those numbers were the same and our urine osmolality was normal, I'd say it's okay, but I don't think it's okay.
Jeff Jones, one more question. Oh.
Microphone's not on.
A urinologist.
Yep.
It says it's on, but okay, here we go. Having access to a recycling capability is key to getting the crew to be able to drink without fear. Expedition 6, we had limited upmass. The crew had to cut back, and that was clearly not the medically right thing to do. So for answer to Kaz's questions, as long as we have 99% recycling capability, I think we'll be fine to be able to maintain too.
Just one more question. We've got it. We're going to have to go.
Okay, I'll shout. Wait for a mic. So I wanted you guys to comment on communication modes. Talked about IP phone, talked about space to ground. Exploration, we're going to be storing forward, but that's how we communicate with our teenagers as well today, right? Via text. So I just wanted you to hear some of your comments about the doctor-patient relationship and how you build that when you can't communicate as readily.
A quick answer, we do email quite a bit, and we get information as fast as we can. We have done some things with Nemo when it comes to delayed communication. Between here and the moon, it'll be very, very short. Then it's 20 minutes to Mars and 20 minutes back. You can do it, but you need to do it right. So let me listen to the left chest and then wait for 40 minutes and right chest. That won't work. And then how can we actually get the comm going with the family members? How can it be packaged up so that you can actually get that warmth that you need from your family members? It'll be a challenge.
And I had a further comment too. I spent a good deal of my time trying to draw Mike out of his shell. He's such a shy and reserved guy. So, but this is one of the, and you prove a good point. That's the reason why I feel that a medically trained person should be on board, because the communication is so essential. and particularly catching something early and relieving some concern about a medical issue that might be developing.
But I think it also shifts the criticality of building that relationship to pre-flight. Store and forward will work fine if you really know each other well and you trust each other well. So,
to me, that's one of the opportunities if we actually use the ISS and do analog studies for Mars or Lunar, that you can try out all different kind of modalities of communication and see which works the best. Bring in all these nice scientists like Dr. Dinges to work with you. Thank you all for your attention. Thanks to the panelists.